Hello, and welcome to Artificial Intelligence, the Path to Breakthrough Supply Chain Planning. This is a special webcast brought to you by our friends at Anaplan, Avetta, and Oracle NetSuite. My name is Bob Treblecock. I'm the editorial director of Supply Chain Management Review magazine, and I'll be your moderator for this event. Joining me today is Michael Hugh, a partner with A.T. Kearney. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. If you haven't done so already, I'd like to remind you that attendees are invited to download the presentation, but we've also included an article we published in Supply Chain Management Review on this topic, co-authored by Michael. Just look for the resource icon at the bottom of your screen. This is an interactive event, so feel free to submit questions as you listen to the webcast. If we don't get to your questions at the end, we will forward them to Michael later, and he can answer to you by email. Now, I don't think anyone would disagree that supply chain planning has never been more complicated. Between an explosion in demand signals from point of sale, CRM, and social media, and an increase in the number of functional planners, customs applications, and segmentation of processes, traditional SOP in planning is struggling to keep up. Planners clearly need new tools to address these new challenges. So over the next half hour or so, we're going to have a conversation with Michael about the reasons why artificial intelligence, or AI, and robotic process automation, or RPA, are emerging as two of the new tools that can lead to breakthroughs in supply chain planning. So without further ado, Michael, let's get started. First, why don't you tell the attendees just a little bit about yourself and your practice at A.T. Kearney?
Sure. Hey, Bob. So I work in the operations practice, and really there are two things that I do with my clients. One is think about the near term of the supply chain, and that's how do you digitize, how do you transform in the advances of digital transformation. And the second part is really a longer term view of how do you actually think about reinventing the supply chain itself as we get more digital. So, with that, Bob, I think, your introduction was an apt one. I want to just sort of pause on this slide, which reflects really why we think supply chain needs a fundamental reinvention. If you think about where the consumer is going and what the requirements are, we're really moving towards, a batch of one type of customization. We're moving into giving the customers and the consumers as they want, where they want, and how they want it. And as we go into this more of a requirement, consumer-centric based supply chain, every function from planning downwards requires a fundamental reinvention.
Great. Let's move on. So traditional planning and SOP are no longer enough. So everyone knows that in the best of times, plans are rarely accurate. Why is planning getting tougher, and why are traditional planning tools and S&OP falling short now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, we see this a lot with our clients, and we sort of call it the planning performance trap. So what happens is, we go in, we spend some time, we help the client optimize their planning, optimize S&OP, and they get a temporary bump in terms of performance, right? A better fill rate, better on shelf, lower inventory. And then inevitably, in short order, so that performance gain gets eroded and their planning performance sort of comes back down to where it started before. And it's really a function of what I alluded to on the previous page, which is this requirement in consumer centricity is ever increasing. So between new channels, direct-to-consumer, e-commerce, between introducing new SKUs, faster innovation cycle, more promotions, long tail, new businesses, mergers, divestitures, et cetera. It's all putting structural pressures on the whole S&OP process. So, and we don't see it as something that's going to end in sight, right? With all this digital and consumer centricity, the planning organization is going to be forever under stress to perform better, but the moment that they perform better, the business imposes more requirements on them. So this structural change, I guess, of increasing requirements is really going to be something that the planning organization is going to be faced with in the foreseeable future.
I wanted to, and I may have advanced that first slide a little quick. There was something that you wrote in the article before we move on that I found kind of interesting, and I think it went to this reinvention or die aspect that is impacting, the traditional S&OP or planning paradigm. In the article, you opened with a comparison to how every industry was changed by the introduction of electricity 100 years ago. And what really struck me about that, I'd just been reading the book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth by Robert Gordon. And he tracked, the growth of productivity, both in home and business, for the Civil War forward. And he wrote about not just electricity, but how homes and, businesses were really kind of isolated before electricity and what we would think of as the grid today, which was electricity, running water and sewer, central heat and air conditioning, the telephone, radio, and television. And he talked about how all of a sudden, the home, as a result of those things, became connected to something else. And with this reinvention you're talking about, it seems as if business, supply chain, customers are becoming connected in a new way or a different way that impacts things like planning. Can you talk a little bit about that, since it was one of the things you introduced in the article?
Yeah, so I think the electricity analogy applies in two ways. In the short term, it does allow organizations to be connected across the functions, right? So if you think about electricity as something that powered homes, here the vision is AI and machine learning will power some of the underlying decisions, underlying intelligence, underlying coordination across all the functions within the organization, and in particular across supply chain. So from that point of view, there is that electricity analogy. But then if you think a bit longer term and more broadly, there's no reason why that AI machine learning enabled connection stops within the four walls of the organization. So that connection is going to percolate and go through, cross-organizational, cross-firm coordination and decision-making, whether it's brands with their downstream retailers, with their wholesale partners, upstream with their suppliers. So I think, over time, you're going to see this, just like electricity, you're going to see AI-enabled decision-making and coordination really expand and percolate across both firms and the ecosystem.
And before we move on, I wanted to ask you one other question related to slide 2 that we're looking at now. So when we talk about traditional planning and S&OP processes are no longer enough, first, if you go to like the best of the best or any of the S&OP conferences, it's always I always sort of think of S&OP as sort of the Rodney Dangerfield of supply chain processes, right? All those guys feel like they don't get any respect and nobody trusts their plans and so on. So S&OP and planning always by definition is only, 80% accurate or 90% accurate. What is happening to those traditional processes as a result of all of these new inputs? Why are the tools that we currently use just not up to the task of accommodating all of this new data and new channels we're working with?
Yeah, really. So the current S&OP process, I think the way it's designed is meant to operate in a certain level of complexity, right? Which is characterized by business as we've seen it in the past 2, 3, 4 decades. And based on everything we talked about earlier, this increasing pace of change enabled by digital, this increasing consumer centricity, the current process is not structurally designed to be able to handle that much complexity that quickly. So, forget about accuracy, just the amount of work that needs to be done to even keep the current performance, one can argue, and we've heard this from certain clients, becomes untenable, right? I have to throw more and more bodies at it just to kind of keep the same pace today. So by necessity, I think we need to move to a faster, more dynamic, and more intelligent type of planning model, and one that has to be powered by much more disruptive and innovative tools like AI and machine learning that we don't have today. So it's a question it's a question of necessity, Bob, I think.
Great, thank you. So that's a great segue to your next slide. So I'd like to think of this as 101 time. So anybody, if you go to conferences, if you're watching commercials on CNBC, you read the business publications, or you go to APIX or one of those, we're all hearing these terms: AI, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation. Plus, in the terms of our industry, in the terms of planning, just what are they? Give us a little primer on how they are and what they do and how they apply.
Sure. So, we like to think of AI as broadly any algorithms or systems that helps a supply chain professional, a planner, perceive, make better decisions, and learn in an automated way. So, there's a spectrum of technologies or algorithms out there that can potentially do that, right? To be able to have the ability to perceive, make decisions based on that input, based on those set of perceptions, and then self-improve over time. There are a whole bunch of terms being thrown out, so I just want to give maybe a bit of a 101 nomenclature. So AI is at the broadest level, all technologies that enable us to do that: perceive, make decisions, learn. Within it, there's often what people call machine learning, which is really, those mathematical, statistics-based algorithms that do those tasks. And even within machine learning, there's a subset of techniques. The one that's been getting the most press recently is called deep learning, which tries to mimic how the human brain learns and organizes itself in an attempt to do perception, decision-making, and learning. So, and the other thing to keep in mind is, I would say 80% of all machine learning or AI algorithm breakthroughs today is based on what people call supervised learning or narrow learning, which is just a simple way of saying whatever the algorithm does, it's very limited in scope, right? So unlike the human brain, which is very generic and broad, and you can learn different tasks, regardless of which machine learning algorithm we use, once you learn a task, it's just very limited to be able to perform that task. So if you have an algorithm that learns demand forecasting, don't expect it to be able to now learn, inventory replenishments once you give it data, right? Once it learns demand forecasting, that's all it's good for. So when we say supervised learning, that's what it's really about. It's narrow, functional-based learning, which is where the vast majority of the techniques that are used today and in the foreseeable future is really focused on.
And before we move on, let's also talk about the other term that's up there, RPA, or robotic process automation. I think if you're someone like me who often looks at operations, I think of robotic process automation as, the physical robot that's moving up and down in the warehouse or at a workstation in a factory. But when you use that term robotic process automation, we're talking about something different, particularly if we apply it to things like planning, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So RPA is, often talked about as a simpler form of AI. It's basically, algorithms that allow you to automate decisions or automate processes. I like to think of RPA as just a dumber form of AI that doesn't have the learning capability. So you give it inputs. Based on the input, it makes some pre-coded decisions about a process. How do you act? How do you automate the process? And then it executes against it. And it doesn't have the learning element. So that's the only difference between RPA and machine learning. But here we're really talking about sort of process-based automation, right? So taking an invoice and converting it into a PO, taking a set of inputs and predicting what the demand for an SKU would be. So these are all types of processes that we're talking about.
Great. Now, with these new tools and challenges, you, in your article, for instance, you've outlined, and I see the 5 bullets up there, 5 different ways that AI and machine learning can address these challenges. So why don't you walk through those 5 different bullets and what they mean?
Yeah, so, if you think broadly about AI and machine learning, and there's a lot of things in the press written about it, right? What it can do in supply chain and enterprise value chain. Planning is a very apt and very sort of ideal playground, if you will, for these types of new technologies. If you can think about the structural challenges we talked about earlier that planning and S&OP face, these are precisely the issues that machine learning are good at, right? It's precisely the type of things that it could help human planners do better. So if you think about the first one, right, a lot of planners say there's a huge amount of intensive manual processes, a lot of times done over spreadsheets, done across ERP systems that are not very flexible, et cetera. So if you actually look at a planner's time, how much time they spend a day doing different activities, I would say the majority of it is in sort of low value, manual intensive processes. And these are precisely the types of processes that, as we discussed earlier, right, either RPA or machine learning would be great at automating. So really, it's really about here taking the mundane and the manual out of the human critical path so that, the live planners can focus on more value-added decisions. The second one, a lot of today's S&OP process is very silo-based, and you have, many different factors that drive both the demand signal and then downstream production plan, et cetera. And here, really, what the machine learning algorithm can do, and again, often better than what human planners can do, is to augment that decision-making, right? Look at the different trade-offs, look at the different signals that shape demand, look at which actions coming out of a forecast as you go think about, deploying inventory and production, which decisions have what impact, be able to trace that all the way through and then update the next iteration of forecasting, right? So today, typically, we're very good at focusing on one set of activity, like forecasting a demand, or we're good at taking a demand signal and putting it into an inventory replenishment schedule, or taking it and putting it into a production plan, but thinking about what the end-to-end impact is, thinking about how one driver influences the other and the feedback, we're not so good at. And again, machine learning can help the planning organization do that. The third one I've already alluded to a lot of times, planning organizations, especially large organizations, are a bit maybe too silo-based, and we try to optimize in each of the silos, right, instead of across end-to-end business objectives. And by leveraging machine learning, by leveraging the ability for machine learning algorithms to really enable real-time decision trade-offs, it drives better, end-to-end decision-making that's ultimately tied to business objectives rather than functional siloed KPIs. The fourth one, there's just a massive amount of data out there that is quickly becoming untenable for the traditional planning organization to digest, and let alone, take insights and better decisions out of those data, right? So just taking point of sales data for a lot of our clients, they have all the data, data rich, insight poor, and almost decision non-existence, right? So how do you then leverage machine learning to be able to not only mine the data for insights, but then also put it into a set of automated decisions that can really drive end-to-end better decision making, right? Which is ultimately what the organization needs to be able to drive impact across the planning functions. And then the last one, we've talked quite a bit about this as well on previous slides, just the nature of the demand itself is becoming more complex, whether it's long tail, faster lead time, et cetera. And so the ability for the planning organization to react quickly enough is one area where machine learning can help. So if you think about all of these 5 areas, these structural challenges that planning and S&OP face, across all of these, machine learning as a enabling tool to transform the operating model is a powerful one that can drive each and every one of these structural barriers.
Hey, before we move on to the next slide, I had one question, which is, going back to all the data and things coming at, when we talk about planning, planning, I'm going to use the same word twice. Planning historically was based on what happened historically, right? We're coming into the holiday season and we're trying to project demand based on perhaps what happened in the last holiday season. But, one of the things that we hear is that as business is changing so fast, we are in these new channels that we haven't been in before necessarily. New products are coming on. Relying on historical data doesn't necessarily give us an accurate forecast of what might happen, in the next quarter or the next event we're planning for. Will these new tools help us with that because they're able to get more immediate data and process that and make some kind of conclusions around it?
Absolutely. So, Bob, I'm glad you brought that point up. So demand forecasting is actually the first area where we see the most movement, if you will, with these new types of AI machine learning tools. So to your point, right, being able to go beyond just, hey, what was my historic sales at an SKU location, and being able to adjust a bit based on the planner's sort of knowledge. Machine learning is able to take, dozens and dozens of inputs, right? The historic, the planner's judgments, what social media is saying about that product. What are the different permutations and differences across regions, right? Do the South have different biases than the North part of a market geography? What are the channel-specific considerations? So, machine learning is able to take all of those signals and more, weather, trade and other considerations, and take all of those factors and be able to really determine, which ones matter the most, and how does that differ by geography, by location, by product category. And the beauty of it is, because of the ability for the machine learning to learn, it can make a decision, and then, 4 weeks later, you can see, hey, did its forecast prediction do better than the human planner? And if it did, keep that algorithm going. If it didn't, it would be able to learn and self-calibrate given enough data as time moves forward, right? So in terms of, if you think about S&OP and end-to-end planning, this demand forecasting piece, I would say, is really, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but it is one of the, first ripe areas where a lot of companies are deploying these types of machine learning algorithms.
Great, thank you. So, you go to a conference, you sit in on a presentation like this, and the first thing everybody asks is, well, was anyone doing it? And I know you're familiar with some examples. So talk a little bit about what people are doing today.
Yeah. So, I've talked to over a dozen clients just in the past year, probably more, and almost everyone I talk to, over 50%, are doing some form of machine learning pilots. The majority of it is in the demand forecasting arena. So every logo you see on this slide here are actively driving machine learning-based demand forecasting. A smaller subset, but still quite a few, are taking it beyond just forecasting to other areas of planning, such as how do you make more automated inventory allocation decisions, based on both upstream planning forecasts and downstream operations. How do they use machine learning to automate the production run based on upstream demand signals and downstream constraints? So I would say I haven't seen any client that is not doing some form of machine learning pilot across their planning organization. The question is more about, are they doing it in a very ad hoc, sort of opportunistic pilot type of mode, or are they doing it in a more sort of systematic, vision-based view where they're trying to, do a set of well-thought-out pilots that sort of reinforce each other as they think about how they design their future planning models. So everybody's doing it. The key question is, how systematic and how strategically are they doing it?
Are you seeing things moving from the pilot to implementation?
Yes, still in the early stages, but
okay.
Several clients are, especially in the sort of upfront forecasting piece, have brought it into a production mode where it is the first, before a human planner reviews and adjusts, the AI is the first mode of generating that forecast in a live production environment. So it's happening, and obviously that rate of adoption differs by industries and by sectors.
And one last one along those lines. So if the biggest hurdle is we don't always trust the human forecast, are we even less likely to trust the computerized forecast or the one without human intervention necessarily? Is that the biggest hurdle?
I think there are a number of hurdles. I think which goes back to the question that I posed earlier, right? Do we just want to do pilots, or do we want to think about a well-structured organizational operating model that allows us to scale up? I think if you think about the hurdles, there's also ones around the change management, because the planners have a very set way of doing their job, and there's a set processes. And the question is, how do you sort of design a machine learning based approach that helps them rather than perceived or in real life hinders what they can do, right? So, as we work with clients, what we like to do is tell them to really adopt a sort of a voice of a customer view to their planners, almost think about their planners and their forecasting people as customers, and really figure out what is that journey, that customer journey that they take, what are the pain points that they have today, how can machine learning sort of enhance and make their jobs easier, make their jobs better, empower them, rather than sort of use it as, hey, here's a machine learning algorithm that's going to replace your job, right? And if you do that, so what you'll see is the organization then starts to embrace the tool. So at a minimum, it's not about, hey, can I trust the machine learning algorithm, but it's more about, can I trust the integrated solution of humans that leverage the machine learning algorithm? So I think helping to reframe that sort of question is one of the key steps.
Great. So on this next slide, or next couple of slides, we're going to start about and talking about what drives success and where do we start. And the first thing up on top there, you've got talking about digital pilots are insufficient, something we just referred to a moment, and a new model is needed. So tell us about Sense and Pivot to get this started.
Yeah. So let me maybe use an analogy. It's an interesting one I heard. Someone said, planning is like climbing Mount Everest, right? No one ever died climbing Mount Everest because they didn't have a plan. They died because there was a unforeseen situation, and they didn't have the ability to react to it fast enough and in an effective way. So I think, in some sense, that is a good analogy for planning, because it's one thing to have a plan, it's one thing to have an S&OP process, it's one thing to digitize it to be more efficient on that process. But really, in the world where we have more uncontrollable events, in a world where changes are becoming faster and more unpredictable, more complex, how can we fundamentally, powered by machine learning, but how can we fundamentally change the organization, the planning operating model, so it can be faster and better at making decisions in the face of unpredictability, right? So that's what we call Sense and Pivot. So it's an organizational capability. It's not just something that I think machine learning as a technology enabler can solve, but it's more about, how do I build new organizational processes, decision rights, and new ways of working So similar to that climber on Mount Everest, they have the ability to sense and pivot and act in a more agile way to make better decisions as a way to redefine what planning looks like. Right? So the sense and pivots is just as critical in our mind as the sort of x-axis of embedding AI technologies. Because if you just embed the technologies without adopting this new way and this new sense and pivot vision for the planning organization, it won't ultimately get to where you need to go, which is what we talked about, right? A scalable organization, a scalable planning solution that can address the headwinds that we mentioned earlier.
And is that what you mean? So if I'm looking at the 2/2 slide, on the left-hand side we've got S&OP and optimization, and below I loved this. Today we plan and pray, and the new model, what you're calling adaptive planning, is now using these new digital tools that we've been talking about to do adaptive planning, which is adapting to if I understand correctly, adapting to changes as they're happening.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. So I'll give you a couple of quick examples, right? So with one client, here's the question they posed. They're saying, hey, if I can do AI, which automates 30-40% of the mundane tasks of my planners, maybe I need to redefine the role of the planners. So for demand planners, maybe I shouldn't have all of them out in the field with customers. Maybe I should have a few in an integrated team back home in a center of excellence where I can both train the algorithms to do the job better, as well as work with my supply planners to come up with more integrated solutions, right? So that's an example of a sense and pivot, doing something organizationally that's different than before. In another example we have, there's a client that's saying, hey, we used to do our S&OP process once a week just because of the complexity and the silos of the organization. But in the future, as I automate and a lot of my processes become more efficient and streamlined, I want to have integrated S&OP team and processes and decisions be made on a daily basis. So that way, I'm really embracing and can look at these different trade-offs between my demand, between my production, et cetera, in a much faster turnaround time. And again, so that's another example of sense and pivot, right? So when we say go diagonal, we mean it's not, you have to both use machine learning to digitize, to automate along the x-axis, but you fundamentally also need to redefine how the whole planning organization would work, right? Redefine the processes, redefine the decisions, and sometimes even the organizational structure itself to really leverage machine learning and AI. So in our mind, it's not about adding an AI engine to your existing planning function. It's more about thinking about what your planning function should and could look like in a machine learning AI world.
Talk about the where I start and the factors that are going to lead to success.
Yeah, if you go to the next page, I think here are some sort of thematic things that we tell clients, when they say, hey, where do I start, right? We say the first one is, it's okay to go and start some pilots as a way to learn, but really you have to start with, what is sort of your 3 to 5 year view of where you want your planning organizations to be, right? What is the scenario as you embrace more AI and machine learning? What should that planning organization look like 3 to 5 years out? And what's the purpose? What is the vision? What does that model look like in the future? And really that becomes your North Star blueprint to really think about, okay, well, where am I going to drive my pilots? Where am I going to invest in my capabilities, et cetera? The second thing to do is really, don't plan to define the perfect solution. Once you have that 3 to 5 year vision, then, start quickly to run different experiments, to run different pilots, and learn quickly and adapt quickly along the way. The third sort of thing we stress to clients is, the technology, the machine learning algorithm is only one part of it. There's a much bigger spectrum of things to consider, as you embrace this journey. Data management, where are you going to have all of your data centralized so the machine learning can learn faster, or do you want to keep your data distributed? How do you manage the data? How do you transition your data? How do you mine the data both within your ERP and across your supply chain? Processes, where we talk a lot about, how do I need to reinvent my processes to really fully leverage machine learning? And then ultimately, as you think about new processes, new data, then even the question of what does my organization look like, right? Do I still have my sort of siloed functions as I do today, or are there some other aspects of organization that sit sort of on top of those silos? So what we say there is you really need to, even as you start, it's never too late to think about how do you need to change your processes as organization to be able to scale up a machine learning-based planning function. And then last but not least, right, don't try to do all this within your own four walls, whether it's data, whether it's algorithms, machine learning. There's a whole spectrum of technology and other partners out there who can help you and your companies do that in a much more flexible, in a less risky way. You can leverage the best of breed capabilities across the organization. So, defining that ecosystem partners is also an important criteria. So, these four buckets of activities are things that we, advise our clients. You have to sort of look at all four of them. Don't just sort of jump into it with doing some random AI pilots. Really think about systematically these four areas if you want to have really, a path to a sustainable and a scalable planning transformation.
Wonderful. So your final slide here, AI-enabled adaptive planning can enable breakthrough value. So just talk a little bit about that value, and then before we end, I want to remind attendees that you can submit questions. I've got at least one here, and if we don't get to all your questions, we will forward them to Michael afterwards. So Michael, talk a little bit about how adaptive planning can enable breakthrough value, and a little bit on this slide.
Yeah, I think on some of the earlier slides, we said, given the complexities, embracing this new planning transformation is a necessity. So if you think about performance today, whether it's forecast accuracy, whether it's, your inventory turn, whether it's fill rates, and then ultimately driving some form of on-shelf or in-the-basket availability, there is no way, if you're already operating an optimized S&OP process today, there's really no way to drive breakthrough performance. It's always trade-offs, right? Like, I can promise more fill rate accuracy, but I got to increase my inventory, or I can reduce my inventory, but for a subset of my customers, they could feel a performance degradation, right? So in today's paradigm, it's always about trade-offs. But if organizations reinvented and embraced machine learning-based planning across all the different things we talked about, we don't see that trade-off anymore, right? If you really do this where the power of the machine, just like electricity fundamentally changed, how people worked, if you really embraced AI-based, machine learning-based decision-making, better decision-making, faster decision-making, taking the mundane processes out of the equation, being able to scale up the planning complexity without scaling your organizational headcount, et cetera, it really paves the path for what we call breakthrough performance, which is you escape this sort of trade-off curse that we have today between, SKU, service, availability, et cetera. And we're already seeing some forms of this, although in a more narrow piloted scope. Organizations who do these pilots successfully are seeing sort of the escape of the trade-offs and being able to come to a more a much better performance frontier where they can improve both their service and their inventory at the same time.
Great. I'd like to ask, to pose just one question that's come in from an attendee, and it was something I was thinking about before doing this. I covered supply chain management software back in the early 2000s when we were hearing about supply chain event management and supply chain visibility, and they started as standalone applications that quickly became integrated into existing applications. So they were no longer an application on their own. They were now a feature of, the kind of applications that we have. And going around just sort of visiting some planning software companies, started seeing on home pages lots of references to big data and artificial intelligence. And so we have an attendee saying, are the new tools that you're talking about, AI and machine learning and RPA, are they being integrated into the S&OP and planning solutions available on the market, as opposed to being, they're not a standalone thing, right? They're going to be incorporated into the solutions that we're otherwise using. Is that the case?
The quote-unquote traditional planning solutions, they are embracing AI and machine learning modules, but at a certain pace. And I think it's still, the whole market's still trying to figure out which, what's the best solution, what's the best algorithm, how do I integrate it? So they're doing it, but at a sort of measured pace. I think for organizations that are looking to embark on this journey, I think the challenge is, do I sort of wait, or do I start to learn and experiment and think about it now? And our vision would be, you should probably start now, and rather than wait, because the traditional software guys are also trying to figure out what's their business model of the future, how do these new startup AI, how can they be integrated, what that looks like for them. It's going to take a while for all of that to settle. And it's happening, but the pace is a measured one. And our view is, if you want to really get ahead of the curve, you should probably start embarking on some of this journey rather than just waiting on, your top 1-2 vendor and waiting for them to figure it out.
Great. Thank you for that. I want to thank all the attendees who are here today. We appreciate your listening to this webinar. I want to thank Michael this was an article I had really enjoyed reading, editing, and publishing, and I thought a really insightful presentation. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Bob Treblecock.